Good evening, Lake Orion. Welcome to History Now here on ONTV. I'm your host, Anthony Taormina, and I got a special guest with me today, Joe Johnson.
Hey, Anthony.
Joe,
thanks for having me.
Oh, yeah, always a pleasure. I want to talk about something that you and I both really like, along with millions of other fans, is the Marvel Cinematic Universe.
Oh, definitely.
We recently ended Phase 3 of the MCU. We're going to go into Phase 4. So we want to flash back about the first three phases of the MCU, also focusing on the 23-24 movies that came out, with the far recent one being Spider-Man Far From Home. But I want to go with the beginning. The beginning was Iron Man in 2008, kind of set the tone. Even though the timeline, you could start with Captain America's First Avengers. Right. But let's talk about Iron Man and how that set up the MCU.
Yeah, Iron Man set the tone, set the humor, the basic structure of just about every movie that followed. Robert Downey Jr. Just knocked it out of the park. He was so good in that movie, and it set the standard. And when a lot of people ask me, what's your favorite movie in the Marvel Cinematic Universe? I got to go to Iron Man. Not only was it a great movie with great moments, but because of the fact that it set this whole universe in motion, it would be difficult for me to pick any other movie above Iron Man. I do love a lot of the movies that we'll get to, but Iron Man kicked it all off. And to its credit, when I was a kid, I wasn't a big comic book reader. I was aware of Iron Man because of some cartoons that were on television that were in syndication and stuff like that. And so when I came in to watch Iron Man, I wasn't real familiar with the character. And the fact that they were able to take a character like Iron Man and have him star in his own standalone movie, I think it's just a testament to Marvel and what they've done with these characters.
Also, like you said, Robert Downey Jr., he had starred in some other movies, but this established him as a major actor and major player. I liked in Iron Man I liked the villain in Iron Man. I thought it was a really interesting villain. Stain, I believe it was.
And it was what's the actor's name? Drawing a blank on the actor's name, but the fact that he was kind of an ally who sort of turned. That was really interesting, and I think one of the reasons that Robert Downey Jr. was such a great casting choice is that him and Tony Stark have a lot in common. They have some similarities where in the comic books, Tony Stark had problems with substance abuse, and Robert Downey Jr. has a known history of substance abuse, and he's turned his life around. And so I think he was able to draw on that as Iron Man, because I think it was Iron Man 2, they dabbled in that a little bit, that he was kind of hitting the bottle a little bit. So he was just so perfectly cast in this movie.
Also, we see Pepper Potts in this movie, too.
That's right.
We began to see the side characters start to come in. But yeah, Iron Man did set off the MCU. Another movie that I wanted to talk about was The Incredible Hulk. It came out during this time also.
Now, is that the one with...
it's the second one.
Okay, yeah.
Not the one in 2003, the one in 2008.
Yeah, the Ang Lee directed Hulk, I didn't care for at all. I was actually shocked when just a few years later they kind of ignored that one and rebooted it. I think what we pretty much learned with the second version with, gosh, I'm drawing a blank on the actor's name who played...
It was the guy before...
Yeah. But I think what we learned is Hulk is best in ensemble pieces and not necessarily Edward Norton is the name I was thinking of, and not in standalone movies. I think he's at his best when he's fighting alongside the Avengers.
But it also introduced a very important character that we'll get to later on, Thaddeus Ross, William Hurt. He is so good in that role.
Oh, definitely.
I mean, when we talk about him when we get to Civil War, he just is, I would say, the perfect character for Thaddeus Ross.
Oh, definitely. I agree. And that's one thing that, Marvel and Disney has done time and time again. It's just perfectly cast these roles. When you think about Chris Evans and Chris Hemsworth and Anthony or Robert Downey Jr., they will always be tied to these characters. And anyone who comes in and tries to play these characters in the future are going to have to be compared to these actors who are just so perfectly cast in these roles.
I agree. So we had the Incredible Hulk also happen in 2008, but then we also have Captain America, the first Avenger.
Yeah.
That introduced Captain America into the MCU. Chris Evans. It also introduced Sebastian Stan as Bucky Barnes. Talk about Captain America and how that became a series.
That is one of my all-time favorite movies in the Marvel universe. It's right up there with Iron Man. I could almost call it 1A if I were to list my favorites. I love the fact that they went back to the World War II time period. It's a great, flag-waving, patriotic film that has you walking, out of the theater loving your country and proud of your country. Again, Chris Evans, what they did with the effects where they made him look like a 98-pound weakling, and then he gets the soldier super serum and he comes out all muscular and everything. Those effects were remarkable, what they were able to do with that. Red Skull was a great villain, maybe one of the best villains in the entire series. Zola. Yeah. And I absolutely loved it. And when you think about it, Captain America has become such a vital part of this whole sequence of movies. When you look at his sequels like Civil War and Winter Soldier, those are, you could almost consider those Avengers movies because they were under the banner of Captain America, but just about all of his cohorts were in these films with him. And I love his story arc, how in the first movie he's this flag-waving patriot, but then when they planted the seed in Avengers when he started to realize that S.H.I.E.L.D. and the government was using this technology to develop weapons, and he got more and more cynical and suspicious until the government turned around and declared him an enemy. I think out of all the Avengers, I think he has the most interesting story arc to see what he's become. And then, we're going to get to Endgame in a little bit, but they kind of brought his arc to an end in Endgame. So we basically have seen his entire story arc throughout these movies, and he's up there with Tony Stark. Captain America is one of the key principles of this entire universe.
Another character we see his story arc get introduced is Thor. The first Thor movie. What was your take about the first Thor movie?
Here's the interesting thing about Thor. Again, I wasn't real familiar with the character. I didn't read his comics. And when they announced they were doing a standalone movie, I did not go see it in the theater when it first came out. And then some family members, I got together for like the holidays or something, and we were talking about the Marvel movies, and they said, "Have you seen the Thor movie?" And I said, "No, I'm not interested in that." And they said, my cousin went over, grabbed the Blu-ray, handed it to me, and said, "Go home and watch this." So I went home, popped it in, and I was mad at myself for doubting Marvel, for doubting Disney. I really enjoyed the first Thor movie. I thought Chris Hemsworth did an amazing job with the character. And watching his character arc, it seems like Marvel was trying to figure out what to do with Thor. In the sequel, Dark World, they went a little darker with his character. But then, like with Ragnarok, they decided to lighten him up a little bit, and that's when he started firing on all cylinders, in my opinion, as he's become almost kind of comic relief in the Marvel Cinematic Universe. And I've really enjoyed watching his character and seeing it evolve through Endgame when we got the Big Lebowski Thor. So I've really enjoyed watching what they've done with his character.
We also got a couple of other characters they introduced in Thor. We're going to talk about that we're going to talk about that briefly, but during that time, Iron Man 2 was also happening, and we get introduced to a very interesting character that's a very important character, Scarlett Johansson, Black Widow.
Is that where she was introduced
Yes.
in Iron Man 2? All right. Yeah, she became a key player after that. Unfortunately, Iron Man 2, if I was to rank my Marvel movies, that would be near the bottom of my list.
I actually liked it.
Did you? I didn't like the tone. I didn't like that they went dark with it and watching Tony Stark have his issues. And I know that's part of his character, but it's hard for me to watch that. So it's not one of my favorite Marvel movies. But if that's where Black Widow was introduced, that's such a milestone because she became, one of the key roster members.
Yes.
And so it's important that they were able to introduce her in that film.
Then also we had War Machine, Don Cheadle. And
Now when it
he was in the actor was not in Iron Man, but he was in Iron Man 2.
Okay, all right, yeah. So they, I wonder if that first actor is kicking himself for stepping away from that franchise because, Don Cheadle came in and he's one of my favorite actors. He did a great job, and so they did bring in some important characters, but yeah, I rank Iron Man 2. Pretty low, and I wasn't a big fan of the villain Whiplash, I think it was. Was that Mickey Rourke who played Whiplash?
Yes.
Yeah, so it's not one of my favorites, but it did help move Tony Stark's story along.
Back to Thor, we are also introduced to Jeremy Renner, Hawkeye.
Oh yeah.
He played a small role, but he played a he played a important role.
Yeah.
And, so I want to get your thoughts on the introduction of Hawkeye.
Well, Hawkeye, he gets a lot of flack from Marvel fans. Of all the characters, his powers are probably the least impressive. I have enjoyed his character, and I thought they did a really nice job with him in Endgame, bringing him back for Endgame, showing that he had sort of taken a dark turn. And what was the Ronin? Was that his name
Ronin,
in
yes.
Endgame? That he had become almost like a completely different vigilante character because of the circumstances that we witnessed in Infinity War. So I like what they did with him, and I was kind of hoping in Endgame, when Black Widow and Hawkeye had to retrieve the stone, not knowing that a sacrifice had to be made. I would have liked to have seen Hawkeye be the one who made the sacrifice because of the fact that his character had been sort of mocked by the online community for such a long time. Imagine if he would have given himself to save humanity. That would have been a nice redemption for Hawkeye. But they decided to go a different route in that movie. But I've enjoyed Hawkeye. I've enjoyed his humor. I thought he was great in Avengers, being part of that ensemble. So I think he's been a really good character.
Obviously, we'll talk more about Endgame in a little while. At this point, and also the main villain of Thor was Loki, Tom Hiddleston. One thing that MCU gets criticized for is their lack of developing villains. Loki was very different about that. Could you talk about Loki?
Loki, I think, is one of the all-time great movie villains. Not just Marvel villains, but movie villains. He's charismatic. You like him, you hate him. He's just a thorn in everybody's side. You can't trust him. And, there have been all kinds of twists and turns in just about every movie that he's appeared in. Like, you don't know if he's being sincere. You just don't know what he's capable of. And he's been a great foil to not just Thor, but to the Avengers. I mean, he's the key in Avengers to opening up the gate that unleashed this war on our planet. He's one of my favorite Marvel characters in the cinematic universe. What Tom Hiddleston has done with that role, and he's fantastic. I love the character. I don't know why I have this fondness for villains who are charismatic, villains that you kind of almost cheer for a little bit. He has a great backstory of being, adopted and finding out that he's adopted, which is sort of a catalyst for his actions in the future. Just a great character. What a great introduction.
He has his own character arc as well, as we will get to as well. I mean, you don't see that very often where villains get their own character arc. I mean, you see it with the heroes. I mean, you have Iron Man and Captain America. At this point, you had Iron Man, Captain America, Thor, and the Hulk have their own arc at this point. But then you also you don't think a villain would have that, and Loki kind of is that opposite.
Yeah, and I think it's because he's such an interesting character. They decided to keep bringing him back, and he's an important piece of the puzzle.
I want to talk about now the Avengers that came out in 2012. One character that we didn't talk about much that had these little cameos was Nick Fury, Samuel L. Jackson.
Oh, yeah.
How was his impact before the Avengers?
Originally he was just sort of a post-credits appearance sort of a character, but then they started bringing him in and making him an integral part of it, and he really played a big role in Avengers and trying to motivate these guys and bring them together.
Him and Maria Hill.
Yeah, and so he's kind of, the glue that sort of holds the Avengers together, and, Sam Jackson, he's great in everything that he does. But what an important character. I mean, he's continuing to play a big role even into this new phase with Spider-Man Far From Home. He had a big role in that, or at least the character did. So yeah, he's just such an important part of this universe, and it sounds like he's going to play a major role in this next phase going on if you go by the post-credit sequence in Far From Home.
We see his story arc start really in Captain Marvel. Captain Marvel, even though it comes in like 1995, we see his story arc begin. Can you talk about his relationship with Captain Marvel and how that started?
Yeah, that's interesting. We see his origins. We see the origin of the eye patch, which I thought was a little disappointing. That I don't think they needed to reveal how he got his eye patch, especially the fact that he was scratched by a cat. Like, really? In the comic books, he got his eye patch because he had saved a platoon of soldiers. It was a lot more heroic and dramatic. I was a little disappointed with that decision to reveal the origins of his eye patch. His relationship with Captain Marvel's interesting, even though it seemed like it didn't play out as much as it could have in Endgame. They build her up as being this incredibly powerful character, but I feel like they didn't really utilize that in Endgame. But it's interesting that they have this history, they have this backstory, and we'll see where it goes moving forward.
Also Phil Coulson, too.
Oh yeah, and he's been an important part of this too. Yeah.
Let's focus more on Avengers, where it focuses really on the 6 original Avengers: Iron Man, Captain America, Thor, Hulk, Hawkeye, and Black Widow. You see them all fighting the Chitauri army, which is one of the armies that ultimately Thanos will command. And also Loki is in this one. You said made mention that Loki was the big thorn on all the Avengers side. Can you talk to me how the Avengers movie worked out? And it became at one point one of the highest grossing movies of all time.
Yeah, and if I were to rank my Marvel movies, I would rank it number 3 behind Iron Man and Captain America: First Avenger. I just watched Avengers again recently and just marveled at, pardon the pun, at how well the movie is holding up. It's a really, really great movie, entertaining movie, a good standalone movie from beginning to end. If there were no sequels made beyond the Marvel movies, it really holds up on its own. I love the dynamics of bringing all these heroes together. Many of them, we had been introduced to in previous films. And seeing them bicker and fight almost like a family when Iron Man and Thor are going toe to toe, and then Captain America steps in to try and break it up, and seeing them use their powers against each other, I thought that was one of the greatest, most thrilling moments in the entire cinematic universe, is watching these heroes go at it, and almost as enemies, but they didn't go that far. I mean, I don't think they were trying to kill each other.
Right, more like
but it was very entertaining to see them go at it, and now they've all bonded and kind of become more like brothers beyond that.
And sister.
Yeah, and the sister in there. And so it's really, I think Avengers is one of the most entertaining movies of the entire franchise, and just a great standalone movie.
I liked how they did they brought in the interaction between Black Widow and Hawkeye. That's one thing that doesn't get covered really well, that probably should. Hopefully one day they'll do a Hawkeye Black Widow movie, even though we'll find out what happens in the future with Black Widow. But I liked how that relationship was developed, and how much Black Widow really cares about Hawkeye, and vice versa. We get to see that bond. We'll get to see then also the relationship between the 6 original Avengers, and then also we get they all stop Loki, and Loki kind of gets punished in Thor: The Dark World, as we will talk about in a second. But how important was the Avengers to kind of ended the first arc of the MCU with Iron Man 2, The Incredible Hulk, Thor, Captain America, First Avenger?
Well, it was important because in Avengers they planted the seeds of distrust. It was in Avengers where they realized that the Tesseract energy was being weaponized, and so it planted a lot of important seeds in that film. And also, it was, the way Marvel and Disney handled doing some of these origin stories first before bringing them all together in Avengers. And I remember thinking, when they announced they were doing an Avengers movie, I'm like, wow, I don't envy anyone who has to put all these characters in one movie and give them all equal screen time. A lot of times in the past, when they try to put too many characters in a comic book movie, it just falls apart miserably. But was it Joss Whedon who directed Avengers? Yes. He did an amazing job of giving everybody their due screen time and bringing them all together. And it's a wonder. It's an absolute wonder that they were able to make this work. And it's an important film. It's part of the universe and the seeds that were planted. And establishing Loki as a major villain, a major character. I love everything about it.
I think that movie, the Avengers movie, also established three major movies we're going to talk about in a second. Thor: The Dark World, Iron Man 3, and Captain America: The Winter Soldier. I want to first start talking about Thor: The Dark World, because that kind of, you see the impacts of what Loki's actions were done in the Avengers. You see Loki's relationship, especially how much he loves his mom, how much he doesn't really respect his dad at that point. And Thor is basically having to fix Loki's mess. Now, for some reason, I liked Thor: The Dark World at first, but then I also would grow to it has a lot of focal points on Thor's, on Jane Foster.
Right.
I felt like that, and the villain was not very well established in Thor: The Dark World. I thought it could have been much better.
Yeah. I saw Dark World, I think, once, and it's been a while, so I'm having trouble recalling a lot of the details of the movie. I know that most critics, when you see them rank Marvel movies, Dark World is at the very bottom. Most people consider that film to be the worst in the entire Marvel universe, which... Still, any Marvel movie, I think, is better than most movies in the theaters. But I don't have a lot of recollection of Dark World. I saw it once, and I thought it was kind of forgettable.
I mean, it was, but it did further establish the Thor-Loki relationship. Loki, you kind of see him begin to start getting a role as a tweener, kind of anti-hero, both a hero and a villain. That kind of makes Loki unique. Loki is a villain, but he's not exactly a he's got some heroic characteristics. So in a way, an anti-hero we get to see because Loki's trying to avenge his mother, and you know, it's just I thought Thor: The Dark World could have been better. It kind of Chris Hemsworth was not very happy about how that movie went. The director went a very dark route, and it was not something that he strongly considered for a while, maybe not doing another Thor movie for a little while until he had the right director. And we'll get to Ragnarok in a little bit.
Right. Well, you know, it's interesting in movie history when you think about it. The second installment, which usually is the middle act of most franchises, for some reason go dark. You look at Empire Strikes Back in the Star Wars franchise, that went dark. Raiders of the Lost Ark was followed by Temple of Doom. That was a very dark movie. So usually second acts, for some reason, go dark, and that's exactly what they did with Iron Man and Thor. They went really, really dark for the second act.
Speaking of Iron Man, let's go to Iron Man 3. They made a third Iron Man movie. I thought the third Iron Man was really well done. I thought it was really well done.
It was a character piece, dialogue driven, not a lot of action. But the relationship between Tony Stark and the young boy in the movie, I thought was really
Harley
interesting.
Keener.
Who made a small cameo in Endgame. He attended Tony Stark's funeral, and it makes you wonder if he's going to play a larger role going forward. But yeah, I found Iron Man 3 entertaining. It's not one of my favorite Marvel movies, but I thought it was an interesting character-driven piece.
I liked how they put War Machine kind of the Iron Patriot. I liked the villain, Killian, which became a fake Mandarin.
Yeah, and I know that's one of the
Kingsley
reasons that
was
this
in it
movie
too.
doesn't rank very highly is a lot of people are critical of how they handle the Mandarin character. Like, at first you thought he was going to be, you know, a formidable foe for Iron Man, and then you realize it's all a facade. And a lot of people were disappointed in that because, you know, I guess Mandarin was a pretty big villain in the comics. Now, I did hear some talk that the real Mandarin may play a role in future Marvel movies, so we'll see if that plays out.
But it also focuses on Tony Stark and how he struggled with post-traumatic stress disorder following the events of the Avengers, and how War Machine and Pepper Potts were all trying to help him through it. And you know, you also get to see the relationship between those characters how get even stronger. I mean, War Machine's Iron Man's best friend, and then Pepper Potts is his lover at the time. 1 second series movie that was extremely successful, a psychological thriller, was Captain America: The Winter Soldier. That was beautifully well done. It was as close to a spy movie and a adventure movie and as you could get. You talk about how that movie became so successful.
Yeah, I know a lot of people love Winter Soldier. It probably ranks in my top 5 Marvel movies. I really like the tone they set. Again, you know, the seeds had been planted of this this mistrust of the government, and then it really pays off in Winter Soldier when it's revealed what the government is planning on doing.
Hydra.
And it was really, really interesting, and that's where, you know, Captain America takes this interesting turn. And then reintroducing, you know, Bucky into the mix as the Winter Soldier, and the fact that he's a villain, but he's also a victim, and Captain America has to kind of see through how he's being manipulated, and it's just a great movie. A lot of people compare it to the great kind of Cold War movies that came out in the 60s and stuff like that. Just Robert Redford was great in his role. He played a major role in that.
Alexander Pierce.
Definitely. I agree when most people rank this movie very highly, and like I said, it falls in my top 5.
We see a lot of storylines in The Winter Soldier. We see Black Widow and how that relationship with Captain America develops. We see Falcon get introduced, Anthony Mackie. We also see Brooke Rumlow, who I thought he was a really good. He played a really good. He played a big role in that movie too. Also, Jasper Sitwell. He was also in Avengers, but also he also plays a role in it too. So I thought it was a really good, beautifully well done. Obviously you have Nick Fury, Maria Hill were also in there. It was beautifully well done with Winter Soldier.
And not knowing which side Nick Fury was on, like you had to kind of step back and see how that played out. And then of course one of the greatest fight scenes is in the elevator. That was such a great movie moment where Cap says, "Okay, anyone want to get off before we do this?" Like he knew what he was getting into, and that's one of my favorite moments in the entire Marvel universe.
I mean, it was just so beautifully well done.
Yeah.
One series that we get we get to see is Guardians of the Galaxy. That whole series, talk to me what your take was on the Guardians of the Galaxy.
Well, Guardians of the Galaxy, that was a comic book I was not familiar with at all. And when it was announced that they were going to do a movie adaptation of it, I was dumbfounded. I'm like, wait a second, you got a walking, talking tree and a raccoon? I thought this was going to be silly, parody, and I wasn't sure if I had any interest in even seeing it. But, of course, by this point, I was like, okay, I trust Marvel and Disney to handle it well. So I went and saw it, of course, opening weekend, and I was absolutely blown away that they were able to create these characters and you felt compassion for a raccoon and a talking tree and the green woman, and I was just blown away. And what Chris Pratt brought to the role turned him into a major superstar. I mean, I know he had, at that point, I think he had Jurassic Park under his belt. But to establish him as a major action hero star was just an incredible accomplishment. And now we're seeing those characters get weaved in with all the other heroes and bringing them together, because they easily could have taken those characters and just kept them in their part of the universe. But now they're interacting with all our other heroes. At this point, after seeing Guardians of the Galaxy, I said, okay, I can't question Marvel anymore. Just about anything that Disney and Marvel put their hands on as far as this universe, they do it right. And DC has been playing catch up the entire time. DC said, well, Marvel's going light and fun, we're going to go dark, and that's just not working in that universe. And now you're seeing them trying to follow that Marvel formula a little bit more closely, where now I think like Wonder Woman did a better job of adding humor and lightness to the films and following more of that Marvel blueprint. And so DC movies are getting a little bit better, but they've been playing catch up to Marvel this entire time.
I agree. Well, I get that will do it for part 1 of the MCU. We're going to do part 2 coming up. All right, fans. All right, MCU fans and History Now lovers, we'll be right back. Take care. See you soon, Lake Orion.
Have you ever wanted to produce your own TV show, short film, or podcast? ONTV offers the training, facilities, and equipment to make it happen. To get started, sign up for ONTV's weekly video production classes covering studio production, portable HD camcorders, and non-linear editing. The 10-week workshop costs $20 for Lake Orion residents, $50 for non-residents. Upon completion of the classes, ONTV's facilities and equipment are yours to use at no additional charge. Produce your own talk show, cooking show, or short film. ONTV also offers a 2-night podcast class, which gives you access to equipment to produce your own podcast. For more information, give us a call at 248-693-3377 or visit OrionONTV.org today.
Good evening, Lake Orion. Welcome to History Now here on ONTV. I'm your host, Anthony Taormina, and I got a guest, Joe Johnson.
How's it going? Glad to be here. Always fun to talk Marvel.
We just completed part 1 of the Marvel Cinematic Universe, and we want to talk about part 2, which will focus on Age of Ultron, all the way down to the future of the MCU. So let's get started. Let's talk about the Avengers Age of Ultron. At this point, the Avengers have already been well established. We still are focusing on the original 6, Iron Man, Captain America, Thor, Hulk, Hawkeye, and Black Widow. Age of Ultron was a very interesting movie. It focused on a new villain that Iron Man and the Hulk and Bruce Banner created, which was Ultron. We also get the introduction of a couple new characters. We have Vision that comes in, Scarlet Witch, Quicksilver, who's originally an X-Men character, and we also get to see Ulysses Khalees, who will be a Black Panther villain.
Okay.
And so I want your take on what Age of Ultron. What your take was about it?
Age of Ultron gets a bit of a bad rap from critics. I know people rank this movie a little on the low side. I actually really enjoyed it, and the fact that it introduced one of my all-time favorite Marvel characters, Vision, makes it worthy of repeated viewings. I really like the Vision character. I like the story arc going forward, how human he's become, throughout the series. So for me, that was one of the biggest things to come out of that. I was a little surprised that they introduced Quicksilver and then they killed him off in that movie,
yes,
right?
They did.
And that was a little disappointing. I would have liked to have seen more of Quicksilver in future movies. Of course, Wanda, became such a major part of the.
Wanda Maximoff, Scarlet Witch.
She's a big part of that, and I saw an article just recently that said in Endgame, when all the different Avengers are taking shots at Thanos, that Wanda is the one that inflicted the most damage. Like, she was angry, and Thanos says, I don't even know you, and she's like, oh, you will. And that was a great moment. So she became a big part of it. I was a little disappointed that they killed her brother off so quickly. And there's also that great moment in Age of Ultron involving Thor's hammer. Do you remember that?
Yeah.
All the Avengers are sitting around talking about the hammer, and this was just these are the moments that make the Marvel movies so great, when they all start taking turns to lifting the hammer.
Having fun with each other.
Yeah, and then when Captain America goes to reach for it, you see Thor sitting in the background looking concerned, like, this is the one guy who might be able to pick this up. Now, the question I have is, was he faking that he couldn't pick it up, or do you think that over the course of events he became worthy of picking it up? Because, spoiler alert, in Endgame he managed to wield Thor's hammer, which was such a great moment. Yes. What's your theory on that? Was he faking it in Ultron, or did he become worthy?
I think he was faking it. I really do. I thought he was faking it.
Yeah. What a great... And really, if anyone's worthy of picking up the hammer, it's Captain America. He's so pure. He's so good. He's got to be worthy of picking it up.
A lot of noticeable storylines happened. At the end of Captain America, the Winter Soldier, we see Baron Strucker, who is a Hydra agent, and we kind of see a little bit of how that story works out at the beginning of the film. I think that's a battle that gets underrated because of everything that happens during Age of Ultron. We also see Helen Cho and what she does in terms of playing a role in developing Vision, and also we get to see a little bit of we see more of Hawkeye in this movie. He's got we're introduced to his family. Also, the one thing that I was not too fond of was the Hulk Black Widow relationship.
Yeah, that seemed a little forced, and they seemed to discard that pretty quickly too. I think they realized that might have been a mistake, but that came out of nowhere. And a criticism that some people have of these types of movies is, why do you have to have a love story in there at all? That's not necessary. So yeah, I think it seemed a little forced, and then they realized that and kind of scrapped that concept.
Because it was like it came right out of the blue. You know, it was but it also set up Age of Ultron did set up a lot of other movies that we'll get to, and just like it did with the original Avengers, it did set up a lot of other things that was going on. We see a new group of Avengers get formed: Captain America, Black Widow, Vision, Scarlet Witch, War Machine, and at that point we get to see a lot of other story arcs take place, like Doctor Strange and Ant-Man. Ant-Man, we see that moment in that movie where Falcon is being sent to investigate, or being sent to retrieve something from Avengers Tower, where they meet up. Let's talk about the first Ant-Man and then Doctor Strange, about how those characters came up in the MCU.
Well, at this point, I was getting a little burnt out on origin stories, and I know they're necessary, at least for people getting introduced to these comic characters. So I was getting a little tired of origin stories. I almost would rather just jump in and see just a full-fledged character. So Ant-Man is not one of my favorite Marvel movies, even though I love Paul Rudd and I love his take on this character and the humor that he brought into it. I actually preferred the second Ant-Man, the sequel, to the first one. And I think it was because of that we had gotten his origin out of the way, and it was just kind of a standalone story involving Ant-Man and all his supporting cast. So he's become an important part of the Marvel Universe and the Avengers assortment of characters, and I love what he brings to the table. Doctor Strange, he's a bit of an acquired taste. His introduction movie goes in a completely different direction when now we're starting to talk about magic and mystic and all this stuff, and that's an acquired taste. That one, I mean, I enjoyed the movie. I enjoy Benedict Cumberbatch, his take on it. I mean, I can't imagine any other actor playing Doctor Strange the way he did. He just knocked it out of the park. But again, for me personally, I think Doctor Strange works best in the ensemble pieces where he plays a role among the Avengers versus a standalone movie. And from what I heard, the sequel, his standalone sequel, is going to go very dark. And it's going to be interesting to see what they do with that. So I'm not a huge fan of his origin story, but I think he's an important part of the Avengers.
I agree. Obviously, following what happened in Age of Ultron, we see Thor go away from the Avengers. We see Tony Stark kind of distance from the Avengers. It will lead into, and then we see Hulk go away into a remote planet. Once we get to talk about Ragnarok, we'll talk about Hulk's role. But one big movie that was extremely successful was Captain America: Civil War.
Yeah.
The Sokovia Accords are introduced. You see heroes choose sides, whether to side with the Accords or side against the Accords, and you see the Avengers kind of begin to break up into two major sides. How did you feel about Civil War?
I recently revisited Civil War. I sat down, watched it, and I think it's a great action flick, and the fight sequences are amazing. Watching these allies fight each other and try not to hurt each other, but try to, go toe-to-toe, that was thrilling. I thought that was amazing, and this is one of my favorite Marvel movies. It's painful at times to watch these characters fight against each other. It's almost misleading to call this a Captain America movie because just about all the Avengers are in it. We do miss Thor and Hulk. They were off, on their own adventure, and I guess I understand why they needed to do that. I guess the producers of Civil War,
The Russo brothers.
yeah, they
Both of
felt
them.
that the Hulk and Thor are so powerful that it would have changed the dynamics of what they were trying to do in this movie. So they whisked them off somewhere else to do their own thing.
Right.
But I think this is just an enormously entertaining movie. Now, to see Captain America and Iron Man kind of turn on each other because of the role that Winter Soldier played, that's painful. It's like painful to watch, but it's so good, and it kind of sets the tone for the rest of the franchise after that. But in my opinion, Civil War is one of the best Marvel movies, and just a great action flick.
How much credit should the Russo brothers get for? They did Winter Soldier, they did Civil War, and then they eventually did Infinity War and Endgame. They deserve a lot of credit.
They do, and also one of the big things about Civil War is we're introduced to this new version of Spider-Man, and the way they integrated him into the series and brought him in, and he came in as like a fan, like, hey, you're Captain America. That was great. That was a great introduction to Spider-Man. Tom Holland is just, I think, the best Peter Parker that we've seen in film. No offense to Tobey Maguire. I thought he was great. But Tom Holland's just been perfect. And again, it's almost like they're listening to me because, like I said, at this point I'm getting weary of origin stories.
Right.
So instead of giving us a Spider-Man origin story, they introduce him to us in Civil War, and then when he gets his standalone movie, he's already established as Spider-Man. To me, that's the way to do it, and the Russo brothers did a great job of bringing him into the mix.
They also did that with Black Panther too.
Yeah, exactly. Give us a little taste, and then give him a standalone movie. I think that's a winning formula.
Also, we get to see some very Helmut Zemo, a very underrated villain. He's the main villain in this movie.
Yeah.
You could argue that the Sokovia Accords. You could argue Thaddeus Ross returns in this movie. I'm glad that they didn't forget about him. They put him in Civil War.
Yeah.
You see the emotions on both sides. One thing that they did really, really well in Civil War was they gave every character a reason whether to side with the Accords or to go against the Accords. And
and there's no bad guy, good guy. You understand their motivation.
and then you see the impacts of the Sokovia Accords will have on future movies. Also, if you watch Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D., the Sokovia Accords have an impact there as well. It actually impacts Nick Fury, Maria Hill as well. I mean, it's just it just tells you how much the impacts the Sokovia Accords and what happened as a result of Age of Ultron, how much it impacts in Civil War and then in future movies where you now have certain characters that are now on the run from the government, and you see the impacts, and the impacts will come in Infinity War. But there's some other movies we got to cover first. We bring up Spider-Man: Homecoming. Iron Man is in Spider-Man: Homecoming. How important was having Iron Man in Spider-Man's first movie?
Well, one thing that did was it totally established that this new version of Spider-Man in the movies is not the character we've seen in comics. To be a protege of Iron Man and to have Iron Man provide the tech and the suit and everything, that took a little getting used to for me because I've grown up with Spider-Man. I watched the animated series when I was a kid. There was a live action TV show when I was a kid. And Spider-Man has always been this self-sufficient kid who made his own suit and made his own webs and went out and got his butt kicked. And so to bring him in this way and make him a ward of Iron Man took a little getting used to because my attitude was, that's not my Spider-Man. But I've grown to accept it. Homecoming isn't one of my favorite Marvel movies. One of my complaints is that just about every mess that Spider-Man got himself into, he created, he caused.
Right.
And Michael Keaton is Vulture. It was an interesting villain.
I thought he did good.
Yeah, but it's kind of forgettable, and so Not one of my favorite movies. Again, I actually preferred the sequel, Far From Home, more than Homecoming.
They say though that they actually also introduced Spider-Man in Iron Man 2 as being that kid that was going to try to take down the robot by himself, but then Tony Stark came
right.
in. That's
Yeah,
what they.
yeah.
But I actually thought Homecoming was really, really good. I liked the interaction between him and Tony Stark. I liked that Happy Hogan came back in there, and Happy Hogan was very instrumental in all 3 Iron Man films. And
now they're trying to create some chemistry between him and Aunt May.
yes, yeah, they're trying to. So I thought that was a really, really good movie. One movie that got a lot of notoriety is Black Panther and his story. What was your take about that? Because it was really, really popular. It won a lot of awards, and it was really, really popular, especially in the African American community.
Yeah, and the movie is epic, and it's important, and it was nominated for an Oscar for Best Picture. This is one of the most important movies in the Marvel Cinematic Universe, establishing Wakanda and the tech and vibranium and all that stuff. What a huge, huge movie. And introducing new characters, his supporting cast, and and I think
he was a great
Killmonger
villain. He should not have been killed off.
Yeah, that's my only complaint of the Black Panther standalone movie is he's such an interesting villain that they should have left that open to bring him back in the future. And who knows? Nobody stays dead in the comic movie, but it was just such an important film. Great characters. And Black Panther's become an integral part of this universe, and definitely one of the best movies of the entire Marvel franchise.
I mean, I thought that story for Black Panther was well done. You had Everett Ross was in there. He was also in Civil War. We see Black Panther's family, Shuri. It was just beautifully well done.
Yeah.
And you see Killmonger. I mean, he brought an approach that was like almost like a realistic villain approach.
Yeah, you understood his motivation. And again, like I said, I like villains in movies where you kind of sympathize with him and you see where he's coming from. And I totally got where his anger and his rage was coming from. And I felt bad for the guy.
I thought that movie was beautifully, beautifully well done.
Yeah.
We also see from the impacts of the Accords, Ant-Man and the Wasp. At this point, Hawkeye and Ant-Man both took deals from the government, and they were both under house arrest. In Ant-Man's case, they actually escaped house arrest. Talk to me about Ant-Man and the Wasp and what your take was.
Well, like I said, I like it better than the Ant-Man origin story. I love the dynamic of Ant-Man and the Wasp. Their romantic history, created some tension in the film. The comic relief, Pena is his name, Michael Pena,
Yes.
I think is his name. He's fantastic. He's great in that role. And the technology, of shrinking the cars and all that stuff. It was a very, very fun movie. I really enjoyed that film. It was like a roller coaster ride to me. So they, like I said, they got his origin story out of the way. They were able to do this standalone movie. And then, of course, the cliffhanger, the post-credits cliffhanger was a gut punch. So yeah,
It goes right into that, kind of starts going right into Endgame a little bit.
yeah.
Also, the Guardians of the Galaxy released a new movie then. It was Guardians of the Galaxy 2.
Yeah, with Kurt Russell
Yep.
introduced as Ego, who was revealed to be Peter's father.
Yep.
I really enjoyed this movie. I liked the relationship between Ego and Peter. I liked seeing the Guardians, their relationships develop. I really enjoyed the sequel a lot.
One character that doesn't get enough credit that probably should is Nebula.
Oh, yeah.
Nebula has a very interesting story arc in this. Both Gamora and Nebula are both children of Thanos.
Yeah.
Thanos actually favors Gamora over Nebula, and it causes Nebula to get very, very angry and bitter towards Thanos.
Sounds like another Marvel villain. There's a lot of similarities between Nebula and Loki. They have similar character
very
arcs.
similar.
Yeah.
And both of them have quite interesting redemption stories too.
Right.
But I think Nebula doesn't get enough credit where she deserves it.
Yeah.
But we'll find out more about that when we talk about Endgame. A movie that another movie with Thor Ragnarok.
Oh yeah.
Takawati. Sorry if I pronounced his name wrong. He directed a really, really good Thor movie. It brought Thor. It brought it more of a comedy, more of a funny. It had a really good storyline, but it brought a lot of comedy, which something Chris Hemsworth, the actor of Thor, is really, really good at. We are introduced to the Grand Master.
Yeah, Jeff Goldblum's one of my all-time favorite actors. I've been following his career since I was a little kid. He was on a TV show called 10 Speed and Brown Shoe, which a lot of people might not be aware of. And I've followed him through, Independence Day and the Jurassic Park movies and all that stuff. And he just was fantastic as Grandmaster. And it looked like everybody in this film was just having a blast, just having fun.
Oh, yeah.
Now, when you read, the Marvel fans online, there's either a love or hate relationship with Ragnarok. I loved it. I loved the humor. I thought it was the most fun out of all the Marvel movies, and it ranks in my top 10 favorite Marvel movies. I love the humor of it, and I felt like they finally got Thor. Like Thor's role in this universe is to provide some humor.
Right.
He's got a bit of an ego. And then, of course, what they did with Hulk. I know some people might have been put off with a talking Hulk because he didn't really do much of that in the previous movies. But I loved the direction the Hulk went and their relationship. I loved everything about this movie. And then, of course, they introduced Valkyrie. Who's a great character, and I guess they're going to reveal that Valkyrie is going to be one of the first openly gay characters in the Marvel universe. But I loved everything about Ragnarok. I thought it just brought much needed humor.
Right.
There's always been a level of humor in all the Marvel movies, but to have a movie play out almost as if it was a comedy, I thought was really refreshing.
It was very similar to Guardians of the Galaxy and how they do their comedy and how their approach is.
Yeah.
There's two things that I noticed with them Ragnarok that I loved Ragnarok. I thought it was really, really good. Well, actually three. I'll take that back. We get to see the Grandmaster and his role pretty similar to that of the Collector in the Guardians of the Galaxy.
Yeah.
And in the cartoons, they say that the Grandmaster and the Collector are related.
Oh,
so
okay.
They got a lot of similar characteristics. I really liked how they developed a female villain in Hela.
Oh, she's one of the best Marvel villains. Yeah.
Did a
Again, she looked like she was having a blast.
She
was having so much fun.
Have her fighting. You don't see this very often where you have a male hero versus a female villain.
Yeah. Well, that's always a touchy area because it's difficult for an audience to watch a male character beat up on a female character.
Right.
So you have to make sure that the female villain is capable of inflicting damage.
Right.
And you don't want it to come across as violence against a woman.
Right.
And so I thought they handled it very, very well.
And she had a blast. You can't ask for a better Hela, I thought.
Yeah.
She did a fantastic job. I hope she does come back. I really do hope she does come back.
Yeah, because again, her demise was, I think, left deliberately vague. We didn't see her death. It was pretty cataclysmic what happened, but there's always that slight possibility she may have escaped it.
Right, and having her reveal as Thor's sister. We also see the development of Loki.
Yeah.
We see Loki becomes getting more and more towards that heroic stance, and Loki actually he tries to prove that he's Thor's equal, and he finally gets that. He finally gets that to that point, and we finally get to see that with Loki. Also, Loki's interactions with the Hulk was very interesting, especially remembering what happened in Avengers.
Oh yeah, knowing that the Hulk has the ability to inflict damage on Loki. When they show the Hulk step into the arena and Loki's like, I need to get out of here now, to show that moment of fear in his eyes was really interesting.
It was funny.
Yeah.
And obviously, Thor Ragnarok sets up into Avengers Infinity War, because at this point, we were slowly but surely seeing Thanos in smaller roles.
Right.
And now we get to see Thanos in a much bigger role. Thanos is kind of seen as the ultimate villain.
Yeah. And if you were to rank Marvel villains, at least in the movies, Thanos has to be there at the top. He's the guy who really created a lot of grief for all of the Avengers and inflicted major damage and major, killed off a lot of people. I mean, 50%. He was a major threat to the Avengers, and I think probably the number 1 villain in the cinematic universe.
But he didn't see himself as a villain. Yeah. He saw himself as doing something right.
Yeah, yeah, and again, it's he has that ego where he's thinking his actions are making the universe a better place, and if you were to really think about it, is there any logic behind his theory that if you were to eliminate half of all life in the universe, would it make the universe a better place? That's a topic of debate, and in his eyes, he thought it was making the universe a better place, but he was willing to make the sacrifice on everyone's behalf. So it's a very interesting villain, very powerful villain, and probably the greatest Marvel villain in the movies.
So now we're at this point in Infinity War. Thanos confronts Thor's ship. He beats the Hulk. He kills a lot of Asgardians.
Yeah.
He kills Loki in front of Thor.
Yeah.
Was that a perfect introduction to Thanos?
Well, yeah, it was, because it showed that he's not messing around and that he has the ability to inflict damage. And I kept hoping that somehow that Loki's death was going to be undone at some point. And I'm shocked that, well, in one way they decided to make it permanent, but then in Endgame they gave themselves an out. We'll talk about that in a moment. And the fact that, he basically sent the Hulk into hiding because of the beatdown that he gave the Hulk. He definitely was introduced as a formidable opponent to the Avengers.
At this point in Infinity War, we see the Avengers are separate. You have a group of Avengers on the run: Captain America, Falcon, Black Widow.
Yeah.
They're on the run. Hawkeye is in house arrest along with Ant-Man. Thor at this point is out in space until the Guardians of the Galaxy find him. How could you tell how the impacts we talked about in Civil War? It split up the Avengers. How much did that impact the Avengers going into Infinity War?
Well, Thanos was necessary to unite the Avengers and bring them all back together to fight for one cause, probably the most important cause, in the history of that franchise. So that's the role that it played, was getting everybody to unite against one common enemy who you needed everybody to come together to fight this guy. That's how powerful he was.
But at this point, they were not. They were separate. They didn't fight united. And we saw Thanos' goal was to find the Infinity Stones.
Yeah.
And Thanos was able to collect all of the Infinity Stones, including killing off Vision.
Yeah.
We see Vision and Scarlet Witch's relationship explored further.
Yeah.
In this movie, we see them kind of uniting in Wakanda. We see really two groups. We see Iron Man, Doctor Strange, Spider-Man, and the Guardians of the Galaxy on one side fighting in space. Then we see Captain America, or at this point, Nomad at this point, because Captain America was no longer being called Captain America. He was being called Nomad or Steve Rogers. Black Widow, War Machine, at this point has turned against the Accords.
Right.
He supported the Accords but turned against the Accords. Falcon, Scarlet Witch, and Vision all fighting with the Wakandans in Wakanda.
Which was a great epic battle sequence. Yeah.
So,
and then Thor, of course, is out
Thor,
running around
with the Guardians.
on his quest.
Yeah. And then also Bruce Banner at this point goes with, at first he goes with Iron Man, then he goes with Captain America.
Yeah.
But we see Thanos ultimately accomplish this goal. How do you think the Russos had Thanos accomplish this goal?
Well, the interesting thing about the ending of Infinity War, it is not the ending people were expecting. It was probably one of the most shocking endings in movie history, not just the Marvel universe, but in movie history. I remember sitting in the theater like someone had just punched me in the stomach, and I remember the audience like sat there like, what did we just witness? And I think the decision to do that makes Infinity War not only one of the best Marvel movies, but one of the best movies I've ever seen. That they had the guts to have the villain win at the end of Infinity War. It was shocking and disturbing, and just an incredible ending to that movie. And just when you thought they were going to take the typical superhero out and have Thor arrive to save the day, and you think it's all over, and then Thanos has those famous words, "You should have gone for the head," and ends up victorious at the end of that movie. It's shocking, but it makes it one of the most compelling and interesting comic book movies ever made, and I think one of the greatest movies ever made, period.
You see so many people vanish.
Yeah.
You see Spider-Man, you see Scarlet Witch, you see
to see our
Black
heroes
Panther,
defeated,
see them,
it's shocking.
Not just defeated, but I mean, it was shocking. That I mean, it was a high risk, high reward type of situation, and it ended up creating the situation for Endgame. In many ways, Infinity War. It set up and you see all these relationships too. You see Iron Man and Spider-Man get played out. You see Thanos' relationship with Gamora. You see Peter Quill's relationship with Gamora. I mean, you see all these relationships, and you see that, and you see it all go away as a result of the snap. And it was like, oh my gosh, it made you.
Now, obviously, we knew that there was another movie coming. So we knew that the results weren't necessarily going to be permanent.
Right.
And that's the challenge that they faced is if they undid everything that happened in Infinity War, then what's the point? Like, why continue making these movies? You need sacrifice. And I think that's the interesting thing that came with Endgame is that they decided to sacrifice some of the heroes to show that there is risk, that there is loss in these movies. It's so easy to snap your fingers and bring everybody back.
Right.
So it was a tough challenge in Endgame to make sure that some of the loss was permanent.
Obviously, we talked about obviously there was a lot of talk in Civil War that somebody was going to die, was going to die, and then in Infinity War somebody was going to die.
Yeah.
And it's not until Endgame that we get to see that, and it was going to be one of the main six. We talk, and Hawkeye was actually not in Infinity War, and that was a bit surprising because because it was Avengers movie, and there was a lot of people that were thinking Hawkeye was going to be in that movie.
Yeah, and Ant-Man wasn't either, right? Because they were both under house arrest.
Right.
So, yeah, they always try to come up with these ways to, if they're not going to include all the Avengers, they give them a reason for not being part of that. But then, of course, they give them an opportunity in Endgame to come back and contribute.
Yep. Speaking of Endgame, we're going to start off with Endgame. We see Hawkeye's family victims of the snap. Hawkeye becomes a vigilante, becomes Ronin. We also see Black Widow forming with what's left of the Avengers. We start off. What's interesting is we start off with Tony Stark and Nebula are both out in space, and Captain Marvel. One movie we covered in the first segment. Captain Marvel. At this point, they did her origin story. Now Captain Marvel's further involved now in the Endgame situation, where now she finds Iron Man and Nebula out in space, and she brings them back. How important was Captain Marvel, not Captain America? Sorry.
Well, that was
Captain
Marvel was Iron Man's only out. Like the only way that he was going to survive his ordeal is for Captain Marvel to find him and bring him back. Otherwise, they could have killed him off at the beginning of the movie and could have done the rest of the movie without him. So it was very important that she was the out that Tony Stark had to survive that ordeal. Now, it was interesting the way they handled her in the movie. Like, they kind of bring her in. She's like, let's go kill Thanos. And then she kind of explained that the reason she hadn't played a bigger role in the events is because Earth wasn't the only planet affected by the snap, that it happened all over the universe, and she had duties elsewhere. So that was kind of a way to explain her absence. And then, she came back when she was needed.
Right. Then we see the introduction of the Skrulls, too.
Right.
So, which is ultimately Nick Fury will be hanging out with them in the future as well.
Yep.
At this point, we see them immediately kill off Thanos.
Yeah, which was shocking.
They killed him off.
That was a shocking moment. Even Rocket Raccoon was like, "Oh my God, what did you do?" That was a pretty shocking moment. But even more shocking than that, when Thor kills Thanos, is when they bring up the graphic on the screen that says, 4 years later or something? Like, what? Like, wait a second, what just happened
It felt
here?
like a defeat because Thanos had destroyed all the Infinity Stones at that point. So it felt like even if they killed Thanos off, it felt like a defeat. So they had to. So it took 4 years into the future to, at this point, Captain America was doing his was holding like support group services. Tony Stark, Iron Man had a family.
The
Black
world
Widow
just had to accept this
it.
reality,
And at this point you had, it was Ant-Man returned, and he came
Thanks to a rat. Brought Ant-Man back, and he realized that time passes a lot more slowly in the quantum realm than it does in reality, and of course that unlocks the key.
That rat's technically responsible for all.
It is. Yeah, that ranch, they have statues made in its honor.
Yes. So at this point now you have them trying to persuade Iron Man to come back and help him. Iron Man reluctant because he has a family.
Yeah, he doesn't, he wrestles with, do we want to undo all the things that he's experienced during the blip, or what is that what they called it in the movie?
Blip.
The blip, yeah. So he had a moral dilemma.
And then you see Hulk at this point. Bruce Banner and the Hulk become one. So kind of like Professor Hulk, kind of.
Yeah, and I know that rubs people the wrong way too. Some people had difficulty accepting an intelligent Hulk, but I actually like what they did with the character, that he was able to find this happy medium where he's able to embrace the Hulk but still retain his personality.
Thor goes in depression. We see...
Again, there's comic relief there.
Obviously, Taika Waititi returns as Korg. We see he becomes Big Thor in many ways.
That's right.
We make mention of Hawkeye as Ronin, and Black Widow really tries to find him. Then Iron Man returns and makes a deal with Cap, saying that if we're going to do this, we don't erase the 5 years.
Yeah, which creates a dilemma that was explored to a certain extent in Spider-Man Far From Home, because by not undoing what had happened during that 5-year period, and the people that disappeared in the blip come back, now there's a 5-year age difference. Like I remember, I think it was in Far From Home, they said that younger siblings in some cases were now older than siblings that had come back from the blip.
Yep.
So that's a tough decision for Iron Man to make and say, okay, if we undo the damage that Thanos did, we can't lose the progress of the past 5 years. That's a tough dilemma to face.
So then Cap agrees to it. They get all the Avengers together. I think for me personally, the most symbolic one was the Tokyo scene with Black Widow getting Hawkeye back, and it really explores their relationship, how much they mean to the other.
Yeah.
So the Avengers are all back together at this point, including War Machine, Rocket, Ant-Man, Nebula, and they all decide they have to go back into time. So they form teams. Iron Man, Captain America, and Hulk and Ant-Man are one team. Thor and Rocket are one team. And then Hawkeye, Black Widow, War Machine, and Nebula are another team. So they go back into certain time periods, and the goal is to find the Infinity Stone. You describe the whole experience.
Boy, whenever you start dealing with time travel, it's such a risky venture because there's always going to be loopholes and things that you kind of have to ignore. The idea, I thought, was genius, to go back in time, retrieve the Infinity Stones to undo the damage Thanos had created, and then the goal was to place those Infinity Stones right back into the timeline. I can't imagine the writers sitting around a table trying to figure out how they're going to make this work. For the purposes of the story, it worked, but when you really start scrutinizing it, you start seeing all these flaws with that particular game plan. But it worked for the purposes of the movie, and eventually they're victorious in their goal. But once you start scrutinizing the time travel element, you start finding all kinds of problems with it.
Then ultimately, Black Widow sacrificing herself on Vormir.
Yeah.
We see Loki.
Big moment.
Yes, and we see another version of Loki return.
Well, that was the out that I was referring to earlier. So, in Infinity War, we see Loki die, and I'm thinking, okay, how are they going to bring him back? And then in Endgame, when they're back in time and the Tesseract falls out, and Loki sees it, grabs it, and disappears. Right at that moment, I thought, okay, there's the out. That's how you continue Loki's storyline, by having him create a new timeline from the past.
Right. So at this point, the Avengers are able to recreate the Infinity Stones, or bring everybody back except Black Widow, sadly.
All right.
And but they also are confronted with the 2014 Thanos, who is far stronger than the older Thanos.
Yeah.
And so now he comes to New York. He comes to the Earth, and he brings the Black Order, the army, and pretty much a big fight scene occurs between Iron Man, Captain America, Thor against Thanos, and then eventually you see all the Avengers, all the Guardians of the Galaxy, Valkyrie, everybody, all the major characters of the MCU fighting Thanos and his army. What was that like?
Well, that's the payoff for 10 years of sitting in a movie theater, watching all these movies, wanting to see all these heroes fight side by side. That was the payoff. And it actually surprised me that Thanos was able to hold his own against the entire assortment of Avengers characters.
We see the Avengers Assemble line from Cap.
And you realize how strong Thanos is, that he was able to hold his own against the entire roster, and each one inflicted damage, and you knew that this was a losing venture for Thanos. But gosh, that really surprised me how he was able to hold his own against everybody.
He almost won, actually. If you look at it, he almost had
close.
all the Infinity Stones, and but we see Doctor Strange give the one finger to Iron Man, saying that this was the one chance they had in about.
Yeah, and all the possible outcomes, this was the only way they were going to win. Yeah.
So then Iron Man knew at that point he had to get the stones.
Yeah.
And it makes a lot of sense with Iron Man being the centerpiece of the MCU,
Yeah.
being the one to have the Infinity Stones and actually snap.
And sacrifice
And
himself
sacrifice
for
himself in
the
the
better
line.
of the universe. It was just such a great moment, such an iconic moment. I mean, he's the one who kicked off the entire Marvel Cinematic Universe, and for him to be the hero at the end, it was just so perfect, such a perfect way to wrap up those first 10 years.
Then we see the funeral of Tony Stark, how much that impacted everyone. I mean, you see Pepper Potts, you see Rhodey, War Machine, you see Happy Hogan, you saw Harley Keener, you saw Thaddeus Ross, you saw Captain America, Thor, Hulk, Hawkeye and his family come together. You see Hawkeye and Scarlet Witch talk about Black Widow and Vision, how much they meant to them. It truly felt like a sense of ending and of closure and new opportunity.
Yeah. Now we probably can do a whole show on Captain America's arc and what they did with his character. I'm not real happy with what they did with his character. You know, he offers to be the hero and return the stones back to their original locations, which there's some problems with that. Like, how does he return the Soul Stone? I don't know how that plays out. But then he does something that's very un-Captain America, and that's he gets selfish and he decides that he's going to use his power to go back in time. And did he change history, or did he create the timeline that we all experienced over the last 10 years? Believe me, I have a million questions about his decision to go back in time and live a normal life with Peggy. So I don't know. That's another topic for another show.
But we see the impacts of Endgame starting off from Spider-Man Far From Home, how Peter Parker handles the loss of his mentor, essentially a father figure to him and Tony Stark.
Yeah, and it was interesting how they had him, they kind of showed the seeds where he might be the next Tony Stark. He might be the one who mentors the younger, up-and-coming Avengers characters. It's interesting to watch Peter Parker mature in that movie. I really loved Far From Home. I think it's one of the better Marvel movies. I liked the Mysterio character and what they did with him. I don't know if hardcore comic fans necessarily agree what they did with the character, but I like the fact that Mysterio was this character who created tragedy in order to arrive as the hero. I thought that was fascinating. And so I loved how now Far From Home kind of establishes where we go from here following the events of Infinity War and Endgame.
That actually ends Phase 3 of the MCU. Now we're going to go into the MCU Phase 4. We have the Black Widow movie coming out. What's your take about that?
I'm not sure. Like I said, I try not to question Marvel or Disney. I'm a little disappointed that we got closure with Black Widow's character, and now we're going to see her on screen again. And the only way to accomplish that, obviously, is to go back and tell an earlier story. But as much as I like the character, I almost feel like they should have ended it with her sacrifice in Endgame. So I'm not sure how I feel about that. I mean, of course, will I be in the theater? Yes, I'll watch the movie. But it seems almost like a cop-out that we experienced this loss, and now she's going to be back on the big screen again.
I'm actually looking forward to that movie. I think, especially what she does after Civil War and going into Infinity War, I think it's a really good story arc to explore. A lot of other movies that are coming out. We have a lot of Disney Plus series. Falcon and the Winter Soldier. Obviously, that'll be a very interesting movie arc. Steve Rogers hands the mantle of Captain America to Falcon.
Yeah.
That'd be very interesting. Zemo's the villain. We get to see a Hawkeye series with on Disney Plus as well. That's another Disney Plus. WandaVision series, another Disney Plus series. That'll be an interesting one. Loki, another one.
Yeah, I have to admit, when this 2019 San Diego Comic-Con made all these announcements of the future of the Marvel universe, I was a little disappointed that it was so heavily streaming based. For me, one of my great pleasures in life is sitting in a movie theater with a live audience watching these films on screen. And almost, about 90% of their announcements at the Comic-Con were these streaming services. And that rubbed me the wrong way, because not everybody has it. And now you're forcing everyone to subscribe to this service in order to watch the further adventures of these characters. And I'm not a big fan of that. Will I get the service? Probably. But I was disappointed that they didn't make more announcements about the movies that are going to appear in a theater on a screen. I know we're eventually going to get a Doctor Strange sequel, a Black Panther sequel. I know those are all coming. Yeah, but I didn't like the heavy emphasis on the streaming service.
Obviously, with we're at the end of Phase 3, obviously the future of Phase 4. What's the legacy of the MCU?
Well, we're going to look back at the first 10 years as a golden age of comic book movies. The Marvel movies were some of the greatest movies ever made. I envy kids who grew up in that time period, who got to go into a movie theater and see Iron Man, Captain America, Thor on the big screen. What a great time to be a movie fan, a comic book fan. It's a great legacy they left. Now going forward, there's talk of, do we bring in a younger generation of Avengers, or at some point do they bring in new actors to play Captain America and Iron Man and Thor at some point? I don't know. I mean, you can't just say goodbye to those characters. They're so important that at some point they may have to recast it and tell stories about these original characters. So it's going to be interesting to see where they go in the future. Will a younger generation of Avengers with new characters, will they have the same impact that these legendary characters have? Probably not. So at some point, Marvel is going to have to sit down and think, do we tell new stories using these characters with new actors? We'll see. We'll see how it plays out.
I mean, you can't deny the legacy of mostly, and you saw at the end of Endgame, you saw that they did the tribute to the 6 Avengers. I mean, you just can't replace them. You can't replace them that easily. You know what I'm saying?
Yep. But they did it, fairly successfully with like the X-Men characters. They had certain actors play certain X-Men. The only one that was the constant was Wolverine. Hugh Jackman played Wolverine throughout the entire series. But new actors came on and played young Charles and young Magneto and all that. So it can be done, and it can be done successfully, so we'll see.
I know that there's talk about another Avengers movie coming in the future with the younger Avengers. So we'll see how that goes. And also we'll see how much Nick Fury, obviously in the Skrulls, how much they will play a role in the future.
Yeah, and I guess that's one thing we should address, is that at the end of Far From Home, they established that the Skrulls are able to impersonate some of the main characters in the Marvel universe. So it's going to be interesting to see what they do with that.
I agree. Well, thank you so much, Joe.
Hey, my pleasure. Fun talking about it.
Yes, definitely. That'll do it for History Now here on ONTV. Have a great night. See you soon, Lake Orion.